The Colosseum, stage for the most cruel and violent games the world has ever seen. In this giant arena, 6,000 animals were slain on the opening day alone. Hundreds of thousands of gladiators, criminals and Christians died here in the name of popular entertainment. A roll call of brutality that lasted 400 years, played out to an audience of millions. It is a building dedicated to the spectacle of death. In the bloody history of humanity, it has no equal.
What can I say about that dreadful place, the amphitheater? It is the temple of all demons. There are as many unclean spirits there as it can seat men.
When I began my research for the movie, what most impressed me about the Colosseum was that it was one of the great monuments of mankind. And unlike any other monument of mankind, it was the one dedicated to death. Entertainment and death, which seemed like an odd couple.
Although it was the place where people were killed, where animals were slaughtered, where criminals were executed, for me it still stands as a symbol of Roman power and dominance, of Roman civilization in all its awfulness and in all its strength.
The Colosseum was built to reassert the power and glory of Rome at a time when the empire's very survival was being threatened. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero ruled over a vast domain that stretched from Britain in the west to Jerusalem in the east. Rome was the greatest power the Western world had ever known. And yet it was being destroyed from within by Nero himself, whose lust for power was matched only by his paranoia. His rivals were removed without mercy, including his mother and 22-year-old wife Octavia. And when Rome was ravaged by fire, he made Christians his scapegoats. On Nero's orders, they were rounded up, crucified, and set alight as human torches. Rumors that Nero had started the fire himself gained credence when he seized 200 acres of the burnt-out city and built upon their ruins his golden house, a new imperial palace with a vast ornamental lake and a colossal statue of Nero himself. This self-indulgent act proved to be his undoing. The army rebelled, and the Senate condemned Nero to death. Hunted down like a common criminal, Nero ordered his valet to kill him. With the emperor dead, a bloody struggle for power began. That year, 69 AD, became known as the year of 4 emperors, as successive regimes were swept aside in a tide of death and destruction. Out of the chaos emerged one true leader, General Titus Flavius Vespasian. The Flavian dynasty was born, and with it, a fragile peace. But Vespasian still needed the support of the Roman masses if his dynasty was to survive. In an extravagant public relations exercise, he set out to build the grandest and most elaborate amphitheater the empire had ever seen. The Colosseum was a direct appeal to the hearts and minds of a people whose culture was steeped in the codes of combat and death.
Rome is a warrior society. Rome conquered the whole of the Mediterranean basin. It did it by being cruel, by destroying everything in its path. When the Romans captured a town, they killed everybody, all animals. They were the masters of the world. And you don't rule the world with cups of tea or only as a veneer. Underneath the civilization. There was cruelty, there was power, and the games represent that power mode.
The origin of the games can be dated back to the 3rd century BC, when they took the form of an elaborate burial ritual.
In the beginning, gladiatorial fights were part of a human sacrifice that took place by the tomb of a distinguished dead person. And they began very small. The first fight we know of in the 3rd century BC was 3 pairs of gladiators fighting. It then became a ritual associated with death.
Looking back from the 2nd century AD, the Carthaginian lawyer Tertullian wrote,
The ancients thought that with this kind of spectacle they rendered a service to the dead, believing that the souls of the dead are appeased with human blood. So they found comfort for death in murder.
From these modest beginnings, gladiatorial combat developed into a public spectacle. Today the violence of those games appalls, but to the Roman citizen, violence was a daily fact of life.
Death is endemic to a pre-industrial society. Life expectation was short. 50% of children born would die before the age of 5. When you entered a Roman city, when you entered Rome, you would see burial tombs on either side of the street. You would smell corpses burning. So death was pervasive.
In this tough environment, pleasures were few and civil unrest common. Mob violence threatened Rome's stability, and her rulers learnt to appease the plebs with subsidized food and free gladiatorial games, bread and circuses. The bread was paid for out of the public purse. The circuses were gifts from an emperor to his people.
The gladiator sports were intertwined with politics. A senator who was running for office, if he threw great games, had a much better chance of being elected than someone who, made speeches, for instance.
No emperor would ever make such a dramatic and generous gift as Vespasian made with the Colosseum. It would be built entirely at his own expense. Within its walls, the whole array of nature conquered by the empire would be displayed to its citizens free of charge.
By choosing to put the Colosseum on top of the Lake of Nero's Golden House, Vespasian was making a very specific statement. The lake represented the abuse of personal power that caused Nero's downfall.
The Colosseum would physically erase the lake from Rome's landscape and history. Nero's pleasure palace, a symbol of corruption and indulgence, would be replaced by a people's palace of matching extravagance.
I always like to think of the Colosseum as a sort of super stadium. After all, we think that the Colosseum could perhaps provide places for 70,000 spectators. But it is significantly larger than any other known amphitheatre. And I think that is symbolic. Rome is the greatest city in the greatest empire. Its amphitheatre has to be the greatest.
The Colosseum would be the largest freestanding structure built in Rome. It would also be built with greater speed than any other imperial project. The reason for this urgency was simple. Vespasian was already 60. Above all else, he wanted to bask in the glory of the Colosseum's grand opening before he died. Even for a society built on slave labor and dictatorial power, building the Colosseum to this deadline would stretch the manpower and resources of Rome to its limits. Of the 100,000 slaves Vespasian brought back from his conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD, 30,000 were dedicated to the building works. In addition to the workforce of slaves, the cream of Rome's craftsmen were drafted onto the project. Every detail of the construction was planned with military precision.
Romans used their organizational powers that come up so clearly in things like Roman law and particularly in the Roman army to marshal labour into reasonable sized groups and make them all work together. So it's quite likely that the actual labour comes from the hundreds, thousands of small building firms around the city who could be organised in this sort of almost paramilitary way.